All right. Hey guys, Ridgeway here. So, gonna try re-recording this just because my first shot at it, my audio was really crummy. So, let's have another go, shall we? So this lesson is gonna be our last one that is kind of, second to last one that's kind of tangentially related to World War One. We're gonna cap things off with a lesson on the communist revolution, which is kind of happening in the midst of World War One. But anyways, that's all in the future. Let's get to this thing. So we are going to be looking at the Spanish flu in 1918. So with this lesson, you're going to want to be using Pear Deck just because that's going to be kind of like how you're going to be interacting with it. I'll make sure I prompt you on the video when give you some times to pause when that's needed. But we are also going to be kind of taking really here just a more kind of reflective moment to kind of look at this event that a lot of folks may not even realize that there was a huge pandemic at the end of World War One that deserves some attention. So a little bit of I guess not necessarily trigger warning, but just a heads up here, and that is so this virus, which is H1N1, the Spanish flu, which is again the topic of this lesson, it is kind of an ancestor to COVID-19, and that is the reason why I wanted to bring it up here. But the point of this lesson is kind of, it does offer some very interesting parallels to what happened in 2020 and what continues to happen as COVID is still with us. That all being said, though, because COVID-19 was just this really, really traumatic, isolating, experience for a lot of folks. It was really hard, for those who lost family members and friends. It's something that we all kind of are still collectively dealing with. I just want to make sure that you take the time that you need to kind of complete the lesson. This is, just an opportunity for us to take a moment and to kind of give us, as I said here, some space and context and perspective to do some kind of meaningful reflection. And again, everybody's experiences in the pandemic were very different, and I want to acknowledge that, and that's just something that we're, still, reckoning with as time goes on. So, with that being said, what are we trying to accomplish here? So we need to kind of understand what were the basics of the Spanish flu, why, how did it work, how did it operate, but we're specifically going to focus in on, just because we can't look at how the pandemic affected, everybody everywhere, we're going to focus on the British response to the pandemic in the context of World War One, and kind of use that as a lens to look at how we react in events like this. So, there's a short video here that I'm going to have you watch. Again, just, click it on Pear Deck. And then I just want you to do a short type up. What was your experience in the immediate outbreak of COVID-19? And I went ahead and I wrote mine here. Very fond memories of Lysoling our groceries, which, as we all know, was very, very effective. But I'd like you to take a chance where you can, share what that immediate outbreak in, March and April was, because that was a really unique experience for a lot of us. All right. After you've done that, let's go ahead and skip on, so that way you can have time to watch that video. We're going to get to the mini lesson, which is, again, looking at the Spanish flu in World War I, Britain or England, and we're going to get right to it. Okay. So, a couple of kind of big kind of questions that we're going to come back to here in this lesson is really this kind of question that you're going to see that the British are going to confront, as well as other countries around the world, is what do you decide to prioritize when the pandemic is happening, right? Because it's happening in the middle of World War One, and that's something to consider. And then the second part is then, okay, so if you're making certain choices about what to prioritize, what about the folks, everyday kind of person on the ground? What are they going to be trying to do to kind of stay in control of things? And so you'll see that word agency. We mentioned that when we were talking about the transatlantic slave trade. This idea of people still trying to be able to express action and be in control when it feels like things can't be. So, With that in mind, let's just do a very, very quick 80,000 foot perspective on what the Spanish flu actually was. You can see a picture of it right here, and with the help of modern day technology. So the Spanish flu, just at its very basic level, was a zoonotic virus, likely originated in birds, that killed. Estimates vary. You'll see everything from about 12 to upwards of 100 million people. Most epidemiologists or historical epidemiologists, they will point to around like probably 50 million. Somewhere in the middle is kind of like a safe guess. The thing that's really interesting about this virus, though, is that we're not actually sure of its clear point of origin. There's some people think it was, a certain U.S. Army base. Other folks will point to other places overseas. We're just not sure. We just don't have a good indication. The thing about it, though, that we do know for sure is that what really helped accelerate it was the fact that it does break out in the middle of World War I. So, again, you have, troops in not only moving all across the globe, right, and things, like ships and things like that, but also, they're staying in incredibly cramped conditions, like trenches and, things of that nature, right, that really helps accelerate the virus spreading. And how this virus works, which is a little bit, in some ways, similar to COVID, but different, because, again, this is an ancestor of it, is that it does very similarly go after the lungs. So, like COVID, lodges in your, sinonasal cavities and in your lungs. This works much the same way. But what is unique is about how it, killed folks. So essentially what it does is it causes a person to, as their body is responding and fighting to it, their lungs fill up with essentially pus and fluid, and they drown in their own lungs. It's a really horrible, awful way to die. The other thing that made the Spanish flu really unusual is that it was really strangely demographically fatal. And what I mean by that is it has this really, if you look at the demographic fatality charts on it, it affects the very young and then the very old, which isn't necessarily too surprising, right? Because for example, COVID really, really affected those who had, immunocompromised, folks who were older, up there in their years. But the Spanish flu, when it also really hits people in their 20s and 30s really, really hard. We're not exactly sure why this is. We think that it likely was some kind of autoimmune response, where people in their 20s and 30s, they're kind of the prime of their strength in terms of their immune systems. And we think probably what happened is that this virus essentially caused people's immune systems to just go nuts and to overreact, and to probably help in some shape or form actually help kill them. So again, it's a very unusual virus in a couple of respects, but it does have some similarities to what we've more recently experienced here with COVID. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here. So and this kind of gets to also some more history stuff that is kind of interesting about how a lot of the work that goes on behind the scenes with these things. So if you're wondering well, how do we know so much about Spanish flu even though it happened now over 100 years ago? And it really is due in part to this one guy right here. You can see his name down at the bottom. That's actually a picture of him many years earlier up here at the top. Right here. His name's Johann Holtein. He actually died just really recently, in 2022. So a little bit of backstory on this guy and why this is kind of just an interesting anecdote. So he's a grad student in the 1950s, kind of a really eccentric dude, which I'll explain here in a little bit. But he and a team of essentially epidemiologists go out to Brevig Mission, Alaska, and you can Google Maps where this is. It's in really rural western Alaska. I myself have actually, because my wife taught for a couple of years out there in Alaska, have been really actually close to this town, and it is way out there. And he goes out here with a team because this very tiny city in Alaska, town is probably the better word for it. So it's just a native village that's out there. This picture down the bottom left is that of a mass grave. of the folks, some of the last folks who died from the Spanish flu. And when he and his team, what they're seeking to do in the 1950s is they are trying to reconstruct the virus. So at this point, like human technology has progressed enough that we can actually see viruses in the 1950s. And he and his team go out here because if you want to find a virus, you need really, really good samples of tissue that have been infected by those viruses. And where can you find really, really well-preserved tissue? In places where it's crazy cold and tissues have been frozen and really well preserved. And so he and his team go out here. They get permission from the village to, conduct an excavation. They actually do grab several tissue samples, and you can see him here back later that same year. Doing some very questionable, questionable in our time, scientific, attempts here. He's actually actually sucking the virus up through a pipette in order to get certain bits of the DNA the RNA of the virus. And today we wouldn't recommend you try this. The CDC would say that's a no-no. But they make this attempt, right? And they actually do not succeed. They are not able to reconstruct the virus in the 1950s. What's even crazier about this story, though, is that about 40 years later, give or take a few years, he comes across an attempt by another researcher. His name's like Tauenberger or something. He's out at the University of Maryland. And they are attempting to also reconstruct the 1918 Spanish flu. So he actually reaches out to the guy at the University of Maryland, and they actually partner together, and they go back to Breivik Mission, Alaska, and they conduct another excavation. You can actually see him here. He's up there in years now, right? And he's got his wife's garden shears there that he's digging with. He insisted that was one of his best archaeological tools that he ever used. I'm sure his wife was really happy about where her garden shears went. But they actually do find a young female there that they are able to extract some of the virus from, and they actually the team at the University of Maryland is actually able to successfully reconstitute the virus, and they actually do reactivate it in a super controlled CDC setting. They test the thing on everything from mice to chicken eggs, and it's crazy lethal. But they learn a lot about how it works, and all that learning actually goes into better understanding how viruses like COVID today work too. So that research was actually really, really cool and really valuable. So it's just kind of, a neat kind of side story that's, fun to see the connections on. Over here on the right-hand side, I included a picture. This is from 1919 of... this was in a journal, a British medical journal called The Lancet, which is actually still kind of around. And you can see here their drawings of what a patient who's dying from influenza looks like. And something that was really common is this middle picture right here, which is the person going through what's called heliotrope cyanosis. So that's basically their skin turning blue. And that's because of lack of oxygen that the person is getting in their lungs. So, yeah, as it says there, the prognosis is almost hopeless. Yeah, this person's not in good shape. So, again, just kind of a good smattering of anecdotes and samples here. It's, something we can appreciate, people doing really, really hard work to make sure that, we learn things from these events. So let's talk about then, let's kind of pivot from an overview of the disease to then, okay, so how is Britain actually going to prep and deal with this, and what are going to be the choices that they're going to make? So, of all the countries that are actually dealing with World War I at this time, Britain, and I'll go ahead and toss the United States in there as well, are actually really well set up to address the outbreak of diseases. So, for example, the British have the War Office that they kind of run everything out of, and the War Office has several thousand physicians that are deployed on the Western Front. Many of them have been pulled from the home front, actually, to be there, because, again, you need doctors, right, that are out there, in the trenches, so to speak, pun very intended. But there's also really, really good coordination that the British have between military and civilian medical authorities. So, you have, local health groups. Today it would be your local health department. The British actually have really good communications there. The problem is, though, well, how do you end up with then, several 100,000 people dead in just Britain by the end of this? Like, what the heck happened? How do you go from, again, like, it's sounding like, well, they're really, really well set up and really well positioned, and then all of a sudden you have, in some cases, like, 2,000 people dying, more than 2,000 people dying a week. That's a, just an, or even in some cases higher than that a day. It's just like, well, what happened? Well, there's a couple of different things. So at its core, it kind of goes down to like 2 to 3 kind of like big things that I would kind of point you to. One is that the 1918 Spanish flu is just, it spreads really fast. Even though there's 3 waves of it, like it just arrives very, very quickly. There's very limited time to actually, conduct research into what needs to be done. But ultimately, the bigger problem that I would point you to is they actually can't identify that it's a virus that's responsible. They think it's a bacteria, and the majority of physicians think that it's something called the Pfeiffer's bacillus. These guys get labeled as like, oh, you're part of the Pfeiffer camp. There were other physicians, though, who disagreed. They think it's like the Pfeiffer bacillus is like this complementary killer, but it's something else that's responsible. We're not sure which. And then there's another minority that says, no, it's not a bacteria at all. It's something else that we can't see. And that group, actually, the extreme minority, were the correct ones. But unfortunately, this kind of all devolves into this kind of nasty disagreement that scientists sometimes get with one another about science, which is it kind of becomes like your ability to detect the virus or not kind of gets then like tied into like your personal reputation as a physician, and that's not a recipe, as we would say, for good science. So like what are kind of Britain's options here? They have a couple of different responses. The first path is that they could just discover the microbe that's responsible, and they can't, because again, it's a virus. They don't have the ability or the technology yet to detect that it is a virus that is causing this. So they actually flatly speaking, you can't make a vaccine for a virus that you can't detect, right? Like, it's just not possible. Unless you, for example, like smallpox, they discover, if you're like, well, wait, they had smallpox vaccines, and smallpox is a virus. Yeah, but that was because it was developed from cowpox and other things of that nature. This kind of particular influenza doesn't have, something like that where you can take like bits of the virus and then turn it into like a vaccine. This doesn't work the same way. So what do they try, basically? They try like mixed vaccines, which are these just ridiculous ideas that we today would just kind of laugh at, which is they basically just shove a bunch of bacteria in a tube that are all related to you causing pneumonia, and they just inject people with it, and they hope that it does something. Did it help? Probably not. It's definitely not a success. We can go ahead and call it that. So then what are they really left with? So, well, if you can't detect the virus, you can't make a vaccine for it, then really all you can do is try to prevent people from getting it and then help them if they do get sick. And that really then is going to kind of become the main strategy. But as you're going to see there, that kind of manifests in some really weird different ways. So so here basically I've given you like the very basic like 3-pronged strategy that the British come up with as their solution to this. One is they're just going to suppress news that the pandemic is happening. And you're like, well, that sounds like a terrible idea. Like, wouldn't you want to let people know? No, because the British thought that panic and, basically people freaking out over the virus would get in the way of the war effort. And like, you're like, well, wait, how are they like able to suppress news of the pandemic happening? Well, when World War I breaks out, Britain passes a law, as does the United States. It has something called the Espionage Act that they can use. But the British have a law called the Defense of the Realm Act. It passes in 1914, and basically what it is, it gives the British government total control over every form of media that is possible. So anything that travels over wires is tightly regulated by the government. Newspapers have to, you can only print like certain war stories with the British, with the permission of the British government. Like it's just not like possible, like that news of the pandemic can really spread very effectively. So if you're wondering like, well, okay, so what's this sentence? Spain is one of the few countries that allowed press to report on the pandemic. That's how this whole thing gets the name Spanish flu. It wasn't because the virus broke out in Spain. It's because Spain is not involved in World War One, and so their media is actually able to do, like, basically, we'll say, free reporting on the spread of the pandemic and what that looks like. So that's how it kind of gets that moniker. So that's one strategy. Just suppress news that it's happening, right? You know, just ignore it. Is really suppress it and ignore it, right? The second thing is then they're going to emphasize prevention. Don't get sick over treating people. So they are going to have folks. They're going to encourage folks to social distance. They're going to encourage folks to put on masks, right? Which we're very used to nowadays. But then you're going to see some of the treatments that they then recommend are just bonkers. They're just out there. And then the last kind of strategy that they have is that they then go to these local government boards. They would be like local health boards for us here today. And they basically give them then decision-making power as to how they should, like, do you need to close down this theater? Okay, good. Like, you're a local government board, go and do that. Do you want to, enforce that, no restaurants can be open after 5 p.m.? They'll delegate that authority out, right? And then we have this quote here by Sir Arthur Newsholme. He's the head of the London Local Government Board, and this quote is really revealing about, again, how the British government is responding. And he says, like, we are at present unable to prevent the spread of influenza by communal means. Notwithstanding this, I did in my official capacity prepare in July last a memorandum for public use. But there are national circumstances in which the major duty is to carry on, even when risk to life and health is involved. So there was several people, like, when the pandemic broke out, like, people were just like, well, we can't, like, shut things down. Like, people just have to get sick and die, and that kind of sentiment would have been very much echoed by the British back in 1918. And today, like, we think of that as, like, really abhorrent, right? Because, like, obviously, like, nobody wants to see their neighbors or family pass away, but for the British, like, this is their response, which again makes a little bit more contextual sense when we think about, like, World War One and their inability to detect the virus. Not saying that you have to agree with it, but it makes it a little bit more understandable. You might have heard of this "carry on" quote before. And I'd like you to type on Pear Deck if you happen to recognize maybe where that shows up a little bit later. You might be familiar with a meme. So if you need to pause the video and type it out, go for it. That way I don't spoil the answer for you here in just a minute. This is where we think the origin of that "keep calm and carry on" thing comes from. Now, this will actually really fully show up in World War II. This really does speak to, again, like, the main British priority, which is just to ignore it, carry on. The second thing, you kind of heard me hint at it earlier, is that the British then are going to make a choice that says that basically the needs of the military outweigh the needs of the civilian population. They are not going to send physicians back from the front back to London and other suburbs. In some cases, there's literally one doctor that is available for more than 5,000 people in some localities. Like, there's just an extreme shortage of doctors that exists because, again, the British are going to prioritize, trying to keep their soldiers better taken care of than their civilians. It's just, again, it's a choice that they're making, right, in the context of World War One. The second thing is that all those mixed vaccines that I mentioned earlier, that they have kind of a dubious effectiveness, civilians don't get those. At least not initially if they're available. All of those go to the military first, if at all possible. But again, then what are some of those other things that then the British are going to recommend for folks? Well, if, like, the military is getting all the priority of whatever medical treatment mostly is available officially, what do you then recommend to folks that they do on their own? And preventative measures, social distancing, things like that. But then you also get, like, for example, a quote that you need to ventilate rooms, you need to eat properly, you need to avoid alcohol. The thing is, though, is that in some of the literature that I've read, the British will then turn around and say, drink tons of booze, because that will get rid. Like, there was one recommendation: you drink like 10 cups of gin, and that will get rid of the virus. I wouldn't recommend trying it. Probably won't work. But yeah, gargle every 4 to 6 hours and expectorate, that means spit, into receptacles containing chloride of lime. But generally, their main advice is just ignore it. And so then, well, if you're an average day British citizen, you're like, okay, well, that's not, like, avoid people, ventilate rooms, eat properly, drink or don't drink, depending on the person that I talked to that told me what to do, and spit into trash cans that are like, that's not much. Like, you're feeling pretty powerless, right? And so then members of the public really do take like the health remedies that are available at the time. We would call these like essentially like quack medicine or homeopathic medicine. They just really take it into their own hands. And so like everything from Turkish baths or carbolic vaporizers, medicated wines, antibacterial lozenges. So that's like a like a Ricola that would like kill bacteria. One of the more zany ones that was, again, recommended by the British government was douching your nose in potassium permanganate. So, like, basically you're taking this potassium permanganate, it's this really deep purple color liquid, and shooting it up your nose and into your throat. The crazy thing about it, though, is actually it would kill you if you accidentally swallowed it. So, like, again, just, an insane thing that... kind of just, a list of just very crazy, insane items that folks are trying. This is one of my favorite mask pictures, by the way, that a lady believes, that she, that this mask is really working for her. So again, just lots of different really oddball solutions that folks are taking for one another, or taking to solve this. I'd like you to respond on Pear Deck, and this is how we'll kind of finish off the lesson, is that there were a lot of different examples in COVID-19 of people trying a similar, like, I'm going to call it like home remedy, but like also like in some cases like Facebook recommended remedy. Do you have any examples that you might know of that you heard people, doing? Like mine was like Lysoling our groceries, which now we know was like not going to be effective against the spread of something that's spread via droplets in the air. That would be a good one for me, but you can't steal that one. So put something that you saw or heard of there on your own, and then I'd like you to also answer the kind of this more broad question: why do you think humans try like homeopathic or non-scientific aids when pandemics strike? So go ahead and answer those questions, and that'll finish up your lesson. And then I will see you guys in the next one. Alrighty. Bye-bye.